Imagine this. You're driving down a quiet Texas highway. The sun is sharp, the road is empty, and life feels ordinary. Then, in a matter of moments, a simple traffic stop escalates into a confrontation, an arrest, and the beginning of a tragedy that will shake the nation. Why does this happen? Why do encounters between strangers so often go wrong? And why, despite our confidence, are we so bad at understanding the people we don't know? Malcolm Gladwell's Talking Strangers is not just a book. It is a mirror that forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth. We think we can read people, but most of the time, we can't. Today, we're breaking this book down chapter by chapter, uncovering the psychology, history, and real-world cases that explain why we misread strangers and how those mistakes can cost lives. Step out of the car. Gladwell begins with the tragic story of Sandra Bland, a confident, outspoken black woman whose traffic stop spiraled into an arrest and, days later, her death in jail. Through this case, Gladwell frames the core problem. Two strangers from different backgrounds, with different assumptions, locked in a high-pressure moment, making dangerous interpretations of each other. He argues that this tragedy wasn't simply about racism or policing. It was about the fundamental human inability to accurately read strangers, especially in stressful encounters. This sets the stage for the entire book. Part 1. Spies and Diplomats. Two Puzzles. Chapter 1. Fidel Castro's Revenge. Picture this. It's 1987 in Bratislava, still behind the Iron Curtain. A tall, slender Cuban intelligence officer named Florentino Aspalaga is preparing to do something unthinkable. For years, he was one of Cuba's top spies, celebrated, promoted, handwritten praise from Fidel Castro himself. He ran networks across Moscow, Angola, Nicaragua, and now Czechoslovakia. But beneath the loyal exterior, a storm had been building. Aspalaga had grown disillusioned with Castro's narcissism, and now he was ready to betray the very system that had raised him. He waited for a symbolic date, June 6th, the anniversary of Cuba's intelligence service, a day when officers celebrated the might of the revolutionary espionage machine. Aspalaga chose that day to defect, to wound the system at its heart. He and his girlfriend Marta quietly slipped into his government-issued Mazda. Marta hid in the trunk, curled in the hollow where the spare tire had been. With his diplomatic passport in hand, Aspalaga crossed the border as if on routine business. Minutes later, they rolled into Vienna, abandoned the car, and headed straight for the U.S. Embassy. He announced himself with a single sentence: "I am a case officer from Cuban intelligence." His intention was undeniable. What followed, in a secured debriefing center in Germany, was one of the most shocking revelations in CIA history. Aspalaga told the Americans that every single spy the CIA believed they had inside Cuba was actually a Cuban double agent. Not one or two, not a handful, every single one. The CIA had been fed disinformation for years. Castro wasn't just monitoring them, he was playing them. Cuba even filmed CIA officers as they planted devices, exchanged packages, and moved through Havana. Later, Castro aired a documentary in Cuba revealing CIA tactics, gadgets, and even officers' faces. The CIA, the most powerful intelligence service in the world, had been outwitted for an entire decade. This chapter sets the foundation for Gladwell's first major insight. If a trained intelligence officer could be deceived by strangers, what chance do the rest of us have? The world's experts in reading deception had been completely fooled. Chapter 2. Getting to know der Führer. In this chapter, Gladwell shifts from Cold War espionage to the tense 1930s, when the world teetered on the edge of war. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain believed he could prevent global conflict if he could simply meet Adolf Hitler, look him in the eyes, and gauge his intentions. This belief in the power of face-to-face judgment is something we all share. We trust our intuition when we meet someone, believing we can read honesty, sincerity, or danger. Chamberlain flew to meet Hitler in 1938. He observed Hitler's clothes, posture, handshake, facial features. He studied his tone, his expressions, his mannerisms. Hitler, cold and explosive in conversation, still gave Chamberlain a sense of personal confidence. Chamberlain returned home, convinced Hitler could be trusted. He wasn't alone. Many British diplomats who met Hitler came away with the same impression. And yet, Winston Churchill, who never met Hitler and relied only on speeches and reports, saw the truth clearly. Hitler could not be trusted. This is Gladwell's second major insight. Meeting someone doesn't always make you better at judging them. Sometimes it makes you worse. Chamberlain's greatest handicap was not his lack of intelligence. It was his assumption that human behavior is transparent, that you can read a person's intentions by studying their demeanor. But Hitler was a master performer. Chamberlain wasn't reading the man. He was reading the performance. Part 2, Default to Truth. Chapter 3, The Queen of Cuba. Here Gladwell turns to another spy story, this time from the Pentagon. Ana Montes was one of the highest-ranking analysts in U.S. intelligence, specializing in Cuban military operations. She was trusted, respected, and known for her quiet competence. But she was also a Cuban spy. For years, she handed over classified information directly to Havana. How did she avoid detection? How did no one suspect her? Gladwell introduces social scientist Tim Levine's theory of default to truth. Humans are wired to believe others. It's a survival mechanism. Society only functions because we assume most people are telling the truth most of the time. When someone lies, they must cross a very high threshold of suspicion before we truly doubt them. Ana Montes didn't trigger suspicion. She was calm, capable, and quiet. Her reports were accurate. She never acted nervous or evasive, so people defaulted to trusting her. This default is not a flaw. Gladwell argues it's a strength, but creates blind spots. It explains why experts can miss obvious deception, and it explains why, even when people suspected Ana, they dismissed their doubts. Default to truth is efficient until it isn't. Chapter 4, The Holy Fool. If most people default to truth, who doesn't? Gladwell introduces the rare and disruptive archetype of the holy fool, someone who opts out of this social contract of trust. The best modern example, Harry Markopolos, the man who uncovered Bernie Madoff's gigantic Ponzi scheme years before anyone else. Markopolos understood immediately that Madoff's numbers were impossible. While everyone else trusted Madoff's reputation, Markopolos assumed the opposite. He wasn't impressed by charm, fame, or the financial world endorsement. He trusted logic over social cues. Yet, the institutions that should have listened ignored him. Why? Because he did not behave like they expected a trustworthy person to behave. He was intense, obsessive, and paranoid. But he was also right. This chapter shows the paradox. We distrust the people who see the truth most clearly because they violate our expectations of normal social behavior. Gladwell emphasizes a disturbing truth. Truth-tellers often look like outsiders, while liars often look reassuringly normal. Chapter 5, Case Study, The Boy in the Shower. This chapter examines the tragic and disturbing case of Jerry Sandusky, the Penn State football coach convicted of abusing young boys. Many people had witnessed inappropriate behavior, showers with young boys, odd physical closeness, secretive interactions, but consistently misinterpreted what they saw. Why? Because Sandusky was respected, fatherly, and known for charity work. His demeanor didn't match the behavior of a predator in people's minds. Gladwell explains how default to truth plays a deadly role here. People didn't want to believe something horrifying. It was easier to assume misunderstanding. So witnesses convinced themselves Sandusky's actions were innocent. One of the most haunting ideas in this chapter is that institutions had opportunities to intervene, but the human instinct to preserve normalcy overrode clear warning signs. Gladwell forces the reader to confront a painful reality. Our trust in familiar figures blinds us to danger, especially when the truth feels too dark to accept. Part 3, Transparency. Chapter 6, The Friend's Fallacy. This chapter introduces one of Gladwell's most important concepts, transparency. Transparency is the belief that a person's outward behavior reflects their inner thoughts or intentions. We believe that, Smiling means happiness, that eye contact means honesty. Nervousness means guilt, that a certain tone means sincerity or insincerity. But Gladwell argues that this belief is fundamentally flawed. To demonstrate this, he looks at how people judge friends versus strangers. We believe we can understand friends better because we see their expressions and hear their tone. But research shows otherwise. People often misinterpret even their closest friends. This means strangers who have different cultural cues, emotional expressions, and communication styles are almost guaranteed to be misunderstood. Gladwell highlights how different cultures express emotion differently. A smile might be polite, not happy. A flat face might reflect concentration, not anger. Believing we can read people is a dangerous fallacy. The entire legal system, social interactions, policing, and politics rely on transparency. But transparency mostly doesn't exist. And when we trust it, we make catastrophic errors. Chapter 7, a short explanation of the Amanda Knox case. Amanda Knox arrived in Perugia, Italy, as a 20-year-old American exchange student, bright, curious, and wide-eyed about European life. She rented a room in a small home with other students, including Meredith Kircher, with whom she shared a friendly but not deeply intimate bond. Everything seemed ordinary until Meredith was found brutally murdered in their shared house. From the start, the Italian police, the media, and the public were fascinated by Knox. But their fascination quickly became suspicion. The press fixated on her behavior. She kissed her boyfriend in public after the crime. She seemed confused during questioning. She sometimes smiled. She stretched during long interrogations. She showed what investigators saw as emotional detachment and, at times, awkward laughter. To the authorities, this didn't look like grief. To them, it looked like guilt. Gladwell explains that none of this has anything to do with the truth. Knox was simply someone whose natural demeanor did not match Italian investigators' expectations of an innocent person. Her behavior violated their internal script for how victims or witnesses should look. This is the core transparency error. Humans assume emotional alignment, that inner feelings must show clearly on the face or in gestures. But Knox was introverted, anxious, and culturally different. Being interrogated in a foreign language only made her appear stranger. Gladwell describes how the prosecution created a fictional narrative around her, one full of imagination, fantasy, and character assumptions, not evidence. The tragedy is that Amanda Knox wasn't convicted because of facts. She was convicted because people believed they could read her. Gladwell dismantles this illusion by showing how poorly most of us understand strangers, and how catastrophic the consequences can be when the stakes are life and death. Chapter 8, Case Study, the Fraternity Party. This chapter brings us to Stanford University and the case of Brock Turner, a gifted athlete found guilty of sexually assaulting an unconscious woman behind a dumpster after a fraternity party. Gladwell reframes the narrative through an analysis of alcohol, context, and human perception. He avoids the easy moral framing and instead asks, how does alcohol change the way we read strangers? He introduces the psychological concept of myopia, not the inability to see far distances, but the idea that alcohol narrows the brain's field of attention. When drunk, the mind loses its ability to process big-picture context. It becomes trapped in the present moment. To a sober mind, this looks like irrational behavior. To a drunk mind, this is the only reality. Gladwell argues that at drunken parties, strangers are not interacting as their full selves. They're interacting as impaired versions, cognitively limited, emotionally volatile, and unable to interpret each other clearly. In such contexts, misreading is almost guaranteed. The woman at the party was blackout drunk, unable to remember the evening, unable to give meaningful consent, and unable to interpret another person's intentions. Turner was heavily intoxicated as well, his focus trapped in the immediate moment, stripped of foresight, ethics, or good judgment. Gladwell is clear. He does not excuse Turner, but he reveals the deeper truth. Alcohol creates situations where people misread each other in the most catastrophic ways. This is not a story about an evil man attacking an aware woman. It's a story about how human beings lose their ability to understand each other when context is severely warped. Gladwell argues that society must view alcohol not as a harmless social lubricant, but as an agent of disconnection, a destroyer of clarity. Part 4. Lessons. Chapter 9. KSM. What happens when the stranger is a terrorist? In this chapter, Gladwell enters the world of counterterrorism and interrogation, focusing on Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, KSM, the mastermind of the 9/11 attacks. The American intelligence community believed that if they questioned him long enough, aggressively enough, and repeatedly enough, they could extract reliable truth. Gladwell shows how this assumption crumbles. Interrogators expected KSM to behave like a typical suspect, emotional, transparent, internally conflicted, or intimidated. Instead, they encountered a man who had no fear of consequences, that no cultural alignment with interrogators, no transparency in expression, no guilt or remorse, no predictable emotional reactions. Interrogators defaulted to truth. They assumed they could interpret his answers the same way they interpret other human beings. But KSM was trained to deceive. He was prepared to outweight, outmaneuver, and manipulate his interrogators. This chapter highlights the catastrophic consequences of assuming all humans communicate similarly. Intelligence officers took his statements at face value, believing they could discern sincerity. Gladwell makes a chilling point. A stranger with malicious intent, who is specifically trained to deceive, breaks every assumption our minds rely on. The result was years of misinformation, false confessions, and misguided leads. It isn't that the interrogators were incompetent. It's that human beings are not built to understand strangers who operate outside our social and moral frameworks. Part 5. Coupling. Chapter 10. Sylvia Plath. Sylvia Plath, the brilliant poet, battled depression throughout her life. Gladwell uses her death to illustrate the concept of coupling, that behaviors, even seemingly personal ones like suicide, are heavily influenced by environmental factors. Plath died by putting her head in a gas oven, a method tragically common in mid-20th century Britain because ovens then used highly toxic coal gas. When the UK switched from coal gas to cleaner natural gas, suicide rates fell dramatically. Not because human sadness diminished, not because mental illness magically declined, but because the means became less deadly. Gladwell's point is profound. Human behavior cannot be understood unless we understand the context in which it occurs. Plath's struggle with depression was real and deeply personal, but the method of her death was not purely psychological. It was contextual. The availability of highly lethal gas created an environment where impulsive acts became fatal. When the environment changed, thousands of lives were saved. Coupling shows us that people are not just individuals making choices. Their decisions are inseparable from their surroundings. Chapter 11. Case Study. The Kansas City Experiments. Gladwell shifts to policing strategies in Kansas City, where officers experimented with aggressive patrol tactics in high-crime neighborhoods. These strategies involve stopping vehicles, questioning pedestrians, and intervening in suspicious situations, an approach known as proactive policing. In small, targeted areas, these tactics worked. Crime dropped. Officers intercepted weapons and prevented violence. But problems arose when these tactics spread beyond their intended zones. Police began applying high-risk strategies to low-risk environments. Instead of focusing on hotspots where danger was genuinely concentrated, officers started treating ordinary citizens as potential threats. Gladwell explains that these tactics depended heavily on context. When used carefully in areas with extreme crime, the strategy makes sense. When used broadly, it leads to unnecessary confrontations, fear among civilians, mistrust, escalations that never needed to happen. The key insight is that strangers cannot be approached with the same tactics everywhere. A strategy designed for dangerous contexts becomes destructive in peaceful ones. Gladwell uses this chapter to show how systems, not just individuals, misread strangers when they ignore the role of environment. Chapter 12, Sandra Bland. The book returns to Sandra Bland's tragic story. Sandra was pulled over for a minor traffic violation, a simple situation that should have ended with a warning or a ticket. But the police officer was trained under a philosophy born from the Kansas City experiments: treat every encounter as potentially dangerous. He approached Bland not as a citizen, but as a threat. Their interaction deteriorated rapidly. Simple questions became confrontations. Assumptions hardened. Bland's frustration grew. The officer's vigilance intensified. Two strangers with different cultural backgrounds, emotional states, and expectations collided, and the result was a disaster neither truly intended. Gladwell breaks down the layers. The officer applied high-risk policing methods in a low-risk situation. The transparency errors led each to misread the other's intentions. The contextual blindness made the officer interpret Bland's irritation as aggression. Default to truth broke. Instead of assuming Bland was benign, he assumed she was dangerous. Sandra Bland ended up in a jail cell, and days later, she died by suicide. Gladwell's message is stark. We must rethink how we approach strangers, especially in systems like policing that rely on assumptions about behavior. Understanding strangers requires humility, caution, and awareness of context, not confidence in our ability to read people. Sandra Bland's story shows that when these lessons are ignored, innocent lives can be lost. Talking to strangers tells us something unsettling. The world is full of misunderstandings, not because people are inherently deceitful or dangerous, but because human beings are not wired to read strangers accurately. Gladwell's message is both cautionary and hopeful. We must recognize the limits of our instincts. We must slow down. We must question our assumptions. And above all, we must approach strangers not with confidence, but with humility. Only then can we begin to bridge the gaps that separate us, avoid the tragedies that haunt us, and truly learn to understand the people we do not know.